My name is Riley Thorne, and on the night I turned 19, my father handed me an invoice for my own existence. It was exactly 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, the final 46 minutes of my birthday, when the heavy oak door of our custom-built colonial in the gated highlands of Asheville, North Carolina, swung open with a violence that rattled the crystal chandelier in the foyer. I was sitting at the massive, leather-finished granite kitchen island, the kind that costs more than a mid-sized sedan, nursing a lukewarm glass of tap water because I didn't want to use one of the expensive K-cups from the 2024 Jura Z10 coffee machine my father prized above all else. He didn't say happy birthday, and he didn't ask why I was still awake. Instead, Gerald Thorne, a man who built a local empire on HVAC contracts and a complete lack of empathy, marched across the heated Italian marble floors and tossed a cold, blue laminated folder onto the counter. It slid across the stone surface with a sharp, plastic hiss, stopping inches from my hand. "Here is the invoice for your life, Riley," he barked, his voice thick with the smell of expensive scotch and the arrogance of a man who owns everything he looks at. $142,675.40. You have 48 hours to sign the repayment plan attached to the back, or I am calling the sheriff to trespass you from this property and everything on it. I looked down at the folder. It wasn't a joke. My father was a man of precise, calculated cruelty. He had spent the last several months meticulously documenting every cent he had spent on me since I turned 12. Through the clear plastic cover, I could see a spreadsheet printed on high-grade 24-pound bond paper. There were line items for my braces at the Asheville Orthodontics Center, the exact cost of the 2021 silver Honda Civic he let me drive but kept in his name, the insurance premiums, my school lunches, and even a calculated portion of the property taxes and electricity bills for my bedroom. He had valued my presence in his home down to the last 40 cents. The $142,675.40 was a tether, a way to ensure that for the next decade of my life, I would be nothing more than an indentured servant to his ego, working for his company to pay back the crime of being born. But as I stared at the folder, I didn't cry. I didn't even look surprised. My father thought he was collecting a debt, but he didn't realize I had been auditing his soul for 7 years, and my ledgers were far more accurate than his. To understand the weight of that folder, you have to understand the man holding it. Gerald Thorne was the kind of person who wore a $5,000 Omega Seamaster watch while telling his employees he couldn't afford a cost-of-living raise. He lived for the optics of success. Our house was a sprawling 5,200-square-foot monument to his vanity, filled with smart home technology and furniture that was designed to be looked at rather than sat upon. My mother had left when I was 6, fleeing in the middle of the night with nothing but a carry-on bag and a look of pure terror that I still see when I close my eyes. Since then, it had been just us. He saw me not as a daughter, but as a liability, a drain on his resources that required a return on investment. While other fathers were teaching their daughters how to ride a bike or helping them with science projects, mine was teaching me the cost of the water in my bath and the depreciation value of the carpet under my feet. The contrast in our household was a suffocating physical thing. My father's golden child wasn't a person, it was his reputation. He was the benefactor of the local arts council, the man who donated $20,000 a year to the regional hospital, and the deacon at a church where he sat in the front row every Sunday. But behind the heavy mahogany doors of our home, he was a bookkeeper of misery. If I stayed in the shower longer than 8 minutes, he would wait outside the door with a stopwatch and a notepad. If I accidentally left a light on in the hallway, the cost of that wasted kilowatt hour was subtracted from the meager $5 allowance I was given until I was 16. By the time I was 18, I was working 40 hours a week at a local hardware store while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, and every paycheck I earned was deposited into a joint account he controlled, supposedly for my future college fund. I later found out he used that money to pay for the new 2024 midnight black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country that sat in the driveway. its leather interior smelling of success and my stolen labor. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the moment the audit truly began. It was a humid Tuesday in July 2017. I was 12 years old, sitting in the back of his then-new truck, listening to him argue with a contractor over a 3-cent difference in copper piping. I realized then that my father didn't love people. He loved the math of people. He loved the way he could manipulate numbers to make himself right and everyone else wrong. That was the day I started my own notebook. It was a small black moleskin I kept hidden inside the lining of my mattress. In it, I didn't record feelings or teenage crushes. I recorded the truth he thought he was hiding. I recorded the cash payments he took under the table for side jobs. I recorded the way he overcharged the city for HVAC repairs on public buildings, inflating the hours worked by employees who didn't exist. I recorded the serial numbers of the high-end equipment he claimed was scrapped but actually sold to out-of-state buyers for pure, untaxed profit. By the time I was 17, I wasn't just a daughter. I was a silent forensic accountant living in the enemy's camp. I knew that his $92 million company was built on a foundation of creative accounting and systematic fraud. I knew about the offshore account he accessed through a VPN every third Thursday of the month, and I knew the password because he was arrogant enough to use the street address of the house he grew up in. While he was busy calculating how much my dental insurance cost him, I was calculating the exact prison sentence for tax evasion and corporate racketeering. The folder on the kitchen island was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the proof that he viewed our relationship as purely transactional. By handing me that invoice, he had officially ended the role of father and assumed the role of a creditor. And in the world of business, once you hand over the final bill, the contract is closed. I reached out and touched the laminated surface of the folder. It felt oily and cold. The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the $12,000 Sub-Zero refrigerator and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. The smell of the expensive floor wax mingled with the sharp, metallic scent of my father's cologne. He stood there, arms crossed over his barrel chest, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He thought he had trapped me. He thought I would beg, cry, and sign the papers that would bind me to his company as a low-level clerk for the next decade just to keep a roof over my head. He didn't know that 3 days ago I had finished a digital transfer of every spreadsheet, every recorded phone call, and every fraudulent invoice I had collected over the last 7 years to a secure cloud drive, with a copy already sent to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the State Auditor's Office. "Sign it, Riley," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "I've done the math. You can't afford to live anywhere else. Your little job at the hardware store doesn't even cover the cost of the tires on that Civic. You sign this, and you stay. You don't sign, and you're on the street by Friday morning with nothing but the clothes on your back. Choose carefully. I've spent a lot of money making sure you had a comfortable life, and it's time I started seeing a return on that investment." I looked up at him, and for the first time in my 19 years, I didn't feel the paralyzing fear that usually gripped my chest when he raised his voice. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I looked at the man who had charged me for my own childhood and realized that he was already a ghost. He just didn't know it yet. I picked up the folder and slowly flipped through the pages. Page 3, $4,200 for the 2018 family vacation to Hilton Head that I spent mostly cleaning the rental house while he played golf. Page 7, $850 for the laptop I needed for school, which he had actually bought using a business tax credit. Page 12, a breakdown of grocery costs from 2019 to 2024, adjusted for inflation. It was a masterpiece of pettiness. It was the most honest thing he had ever given me. It was a map of his own downfall. I could see the way his eyes tracked my movements, looking for the telltale signs of a breakdown. He wanted to see me crumble. He wanted the satisfaction of knowing he owned my future. But I simply closed the folder and set it back down on the granite. The 48-hour clock he had just started wasn't counting down to my eviction. It was counting down to the moment the authorities would arrive with a warrant that would strip him of the very granite island he was leaning on. He thought he was the one holding the invoice, but he had forgotten the most basic rule of accounting. You have to make sure your own books are clean before you audit someone else. Family isn't supposed to be a ledger of debts and credits. It isn't supposed to be a series of laminated pages and legal threats delivered in the middle of the night. But in this house, that was the only language spoken. I looked at the grandfather clock. 11:22 p.m. My birthday was almost over, and the rest of my life was about to begin. I didn't need 48 hours. I only needed one. I looked him in the eye, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had defined my childhood. "I'll give you my answer in the morning, Dad. I think I need to do some math of my own first." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Good. Glad to see you're finally learning the value of $1. Don't take too long. The sheriff is a friend of mine, and he doesn't mind doing favors for people who pay their taxes." He turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps thudding against the marble as he headed toward his master suite. I stayed in the kitchen, the silence settling back over the room like a shroud. I looked at the water in my glass, the surface perfectly still. My father had spent 19 years trying to prove that everything had a price. He was right. And in 48 hours, he was going to find out exactly how much he owed the world for the way he had treated me. This wasn't just a story about a debt. It was a story about the moment a daughter stops being a line item and starts being the person who closes the books forever. Growing up in the jagged, oxygen-thin air of Silverton, Colorado, provided a constant, freezing reminder of exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of the Thorne family, which was usually somewhere beneath the grease-stained concrete of my father's main maintenance bay. While the other girls in my graduating class were preoccupied with the social politics of high school and spent their weekends browsing the boutiques in Durango for $85 Lululemon Align leggings or shimmering glosses from Sephora, my reality was defined by the scent of diesel exhaust and the weight of steel-toed utility. I didn't own a single pair of designer yoga pants. Instead, I moved through the world in a pair of heavy, scuffed work boots I had purchased for exactly $4 at a neighborhood garage sale when I was 14, their leather cracked from years of exposure to hydraulic fluid and mountain slush. My father, Silas Thorne, who was 54 years old and possessed a temperament as unyielding as the granite he spent his life moving, was the undisputed king of local infrastructure as the owner of Thorne Heavy Equipment. His empire was built on a formidable fleet of 28 massive Caterpillar excavators and 12 high-performance D8 bulldozers, a mechanical army that made him worth a conservative $7.8 million. To the town of Silverton, he was a titan of industry and a pillar of the community who provided jobs and cleared the mountain passes during the harshest winters. But to me, he was a cold-eyed auditor who treated his eldest daughter like a broken, depreciating tool that was only tolerated as long as it remained functional. From the time I was 12 years old, I wasn't allowed the luxury of a childhood because I had been drafted into the role of his Ghost Clerk, a silent engine running in the background of his multi-million-dollar operation. While my peers were attending soccer practices or sleepovers, I was hunched over a scarred oak desk in the corner of his industrial office, illuminated by the flickering hum of an outdated fluorescent light fixture that gave everything a sickly greenish hue. Every month, I was responsible for processing exactly 114 complex fuel tax credits, navigating the labyrinthine paperwork of the Colorado Department of Revenue to ensure that not a single cent of my father's wealth leaked out to the government. I managed the intricate maintenance schedules for all 40 of his heavy machines, tracking every oil change, every hydraulic seal replacement, and every hour of engine runtime with a precision that would have intimidated a professional fleet manager. I knew the specific vibration of a failing bearing on a 320GC hydraulic excavator before the operators did, and I could recite the serial numbers of our entire inventory from memory. Yet my father never once offered a word of praise or a gesture of appreciation. He viewed my labor as a debt I owed him for the roof over my head and the food in my stomach, a biological tax that he intended to collect in perpetuity. The physical manifestations of this disparity were draped over every aspect of our lives like a heavy, suffocating blanket of injustice. For my 19th birthday, which should have been a milestone of independence, I was relegated to the driver's seat of a rusted 2005 Ford F-15. Oh, that groaned with the weight of 215,000 miles. The wheel arches were bubbling with orange oxidation from the road salt. The driver's side window only rolled down halfway before emitting a shrieking protest, and the interior smelled permanently of stale coffee and industrial degreaser. It was a vehicle designed for the scrap heap, a hand-me-down from the company's lowest-tier mechanics that my father allowed me to use only because it meant he didn't have to pay for a commercial transport service when he needed me to haul parts between job sites. In stark contrast, the atmosphere in the house shifted entirely when it came to my younger sister, Piper, who was 17 and lived in a world of curated perfection that I wasn't permitted to touch. For her birthday, Silas didn't hand her a laminated folder of debts or a list of fleet maintenance logs. Instead, he led her out to the driveway where a brand-new 2024 bright white Jeep Wrangler Rubicon sat glistening under the Colorado sun. The sticker price on the window, which I had seen because I was the one who had to file the insurance paperwork, was exactly $62,400, featuring the Sky One Touch power top and the Extreme 35-inch tire package. Watching Piper squeal with delight as she climbed into the pristine black leather interior was like watching a live broadcast of my own erasure. She had never spent a single hour scrubbing the grit from a pressure gauge or calculating the depreciation of a fleet of dump trucks, yet she was handed the keys to a luxury SUV, while I was expected to be grateful for a truck that struggled to start when the temperature dropped below freezing. My father stood on the porch of our 4,000-square-foot timber frame home, his thumbs tucked into the belt loops of his expensive Carhartt work pants, a rare, genuine smile stretching across his weathered face as he watched his favorite daughter. He didn't see the irony in the fact that the money used to purchase that Jeep was likely saved through the tax loopholes I had spent my nights discovering in the basement office. To him, Piper was a jewel to be polished and displayed, a reflection of his success that needed to be kept far away from the dirt and the grime of the business. I, on the other hand, was the engine oil, necessary for the machine to run, but meant to be hidden away in the dark, handled with gloves, and discarded once my viscosity had worn thin. The silence between us in that house was a living thing, thick with the unsaid grievances of a daughter who knew too much and a father who cared too little. I would sit at the dinner table across from them, my hands stained with the faint, persistent gray of graphite and carbon, listening to Piper talk about her plans for a summer trip to the Amalfi Coast with her friends, a trip that Silas was funding without a second thought. He would nod and encourage her, promising her a new set of Toomey luggage for the journey, while in the same breath, he would turn to me and demand to know why the quarterly earnings report for the Silverton Bypass project hadn't been cross-referenced with the equipment rental logs yet. There was no please, and there was never a thank you, only the cold, transactional directives of a man who saw his family as an extension of his balance sheet. I learned early on that to survive Silas Thorne, I had to be better at his own game than he was, which meant I had to become a master of the very numbers he used to keep me in my place. I spent my nights in that basement office not just doing his work, but building my own fortress of information, a secondary set of ledgers that contained the secrets of Thorne-heavy equipment that Silas thought were buried in the mud of his various construction sites. I knew about the 2022 incident where he had bypassed the environmental sensors on the excavators to save on diesel exhaust fluid costs, a violation that carried a 6-figure fine per machine. I knew about the private land deals he had brokered with city officials using company resources that were never disclosed on his personal tax returns. Every time he mocked my $4 boots or reminded me that I was a burden who owed him $142,000 for the privilege of being raised by him, I simply added another entry into my private digital archive. I was a ghost clerk, and like all ghosts, I saw everything that the living chose to ignore. The hyper-realistic detail of his cruelty was my fuel. I remembered the exact cost of the premium gas he put in Piper's Jeep versus the regular grade he insisted I use in the F-150, and I remembered the $1,200 fine he made me pay out of my own meager hardware store wages when I accidentally scratched a fender on a company trailer while moving it in the dark. Silas Thorne believed that wealth was a shield that made him untouchable, and he believed that because I was his daughter, I was a permanent part of his inventory that he could manage as he saw fit. He didn't understand that by treating me like a machine, he had taught me how to analyze him for weaknesses, how to identify the stress fractures in his empire, and how to wait for the exact moment when the pressure would become too much for the structure to hold. As I sat in the kitchen that night after he handed me the invoice for my life, I could hear the wind howling through the San Juan Mountains, rattling the double-paned windows of the house he valued more than my well-being. I thought about the 2005 Ford F-150 sitting in the shadows of the driveway, a relic of a life I was ready to leave behind. And I thought about the white Rubicon that represented everything he was willing to give to someone who had never earned it. The contrast wasn't just about money or vehicles. It was about the fundamental injustice of a man who demanded a return on investment from a child he had never actually invested in emotionally. I wasn't just his daughter anymore. I was the auditor who had finally reached the end of the fiscal year, and the bill I was preparing for him was one he could never hope to pay. Every time I looked at the grease under my fingernails, I was reminded that my father's hands were clean only because mine were dirty. He wore a 2024 Rolex Explorer 2 that he had purchased for $10,000 to celebrate a new contract with the state, while I was still using a cracked iPhone 8 with a battery that died if the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. He prided himself on his Thorne Tough branding, a marketing slogan that appeared on the side of every bulldozer and every company truck, emphasizing resilience and strength. But he had made a fatal error in his calculations. He had made me too tough. By denying me the comforts he lavished on Piper, by forcing me to account for every cent and every hour, he had inadvertently created the one person capable of dismantling everything he had built. He thought he was giving me a repayment plan for a debt I didn't owe, but in reality, he was giving me the final motivation I needed to hit the delete key on his entire legacy. The 11:14 p.m. deadline was a ticking clock, but it wasn't my time that was running out. It was his. I looked at the blue folder one last time, the lamination catching the light, and I felt a sense of peace that only comes when you realize the person trying to break you has already handed you the hammer. Silas Thorne had valued my life at $142,675.40, but before the week was over, he would find out that the price of his own secrets was going to cost him everything he owned, down to the very last bulldozer in the yard. The annual Founders Gala at the Silverton Country Club was always a masterclass in performative opulence, a night where the local elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their own relevance while the San Juan Mountains loomed outside like silent, cold judges. The grand ballroom was a cavern of polished mahogany, gilded molding, and heavy velvet curtains the color of dried blood, and on this particular evening, the air was a suffocating cocktail of expensive Cuban cigar smoke, $300 a bottle Pappy Van Winkle bourbon, and the metallic tang of high-stakes social climbing. There were exactly 85 people in the room, a curated collection of Silverton's power players, including Mayor Harrison, who was currently laughing at a joke he didn't understand, and the local chief of police, who sat with a stiff posture that suggested he was well aware of whose bank account funded his re-election campaigns. I stood near the periphery of the room, feeling like a glitch in a high-definition photograph, wearing a charcoal blazer I had found at a consignment shop in Durango for $20, while my sister, Piper, preened in the center of the floor in a $1,200 custom silk slip dress that shimmered like moonlight on water. My father, Silas Thorne, sat at the head of the primary table, his presence commanding the space with the practiced ease of a man who owned the very ground the club was built upon, his heavy hand resting near a crystal tumbler of neat scotch that caught the amber glow of the overhead chandeliers. The explosion didn't happen with fire or sound, but with the sharp, rhythmic clinking of a sterling silver spoon against a hand-cut lead crystal glass, a sound that sliced through the low hum of conversation and brought the entire room to a sudden, expectant standstill. Silas stood up, his 6'2" frame casting a long shadow across the white linen tablecloth. And for a moment, I thought he might actually offer a toast to the community or the legacy of the company he had spent 30 years building. Instead, he cleared his throat, his face flushing a deep, aggressive crimson that signaled the onset of a performance fueled by malice and a decade of unchecked resentment toward his eldest daughter. He didn't look at me as he began to speak, his voice booming with a staged joviality that felt as thin as ice over a deep, dark lake. But I could feel the weight of 84 other pairs of eyes beginning to shift toward my position by the service entrance. He announced to the assembled leaders of our town that I was not a partner in his success, nor was I a valued member of his household, but rather a financial drain and a parasitic leech who had spent 19 years consuming the resources he had worked so hard to accumulate. The humiliation was not merely verbal. It was a choreographed assault on my dignity that he had prepared with the same meticulous attention to detail he applied to his corporate tax returns. With a flick of a remote, he pulled from his breast pocket. A massive motorized screen descended from the ceiling, and a high-lumens projector hummed to life, splashing a series of brutal, clinical spreadsheets onto the far wall for the mayor, the chief of police, and our neighbors to scrutinize. It was a digital ledger of my perceived failures, a line-by-line accounting of every cent Silas Thorne had ever spent on my survival, formatted in a cold Arial font that made my life look like a bankruptcy filing. The first slide was titled Cost of Maintenance, Riley Thorne, and it detailed the $14,000 he had paid for my orthodontic work in 2018. The $8,200 he claimed was the value of the rusted 2005 Ford F-15 I drove, and even the $3.50 for every single gallon of milk I had consumed since my 12th birthday. He had calculated the cost of my school supplies, the electricity usage for my bedroom down to the kilowatt hour, and the prorated insurance premiums for a life he clearly viewed as a bad investment. Piper, fueled by 3 cosmopolitans and a lifetime of being told she was the only child who mattered, let out a sharp, jagged peal of laughter that echoed off the high ceilings, her head tossing back so violently that she spilled her vibrant pink drink down the front of her designer silk dress. She didn't even seem to notice the stain that would cost hundreds of dollars to clean. She was too busy enjoying the spectacle of my public execution, her eyes bright with a cruel, sisterly triumph that made my stomach turn. My mother, Evelyn, sat perfectly still next to my father, her silhouette a portrait of elegant complicity as she reached up with a manicured hand to adjust her $15,000 Harry Winston diamond tennis bracelet. She didn't interject, she didn't stand up to defend her firstborn, and she certainly didn't look my way. She simply stared at her plate of braised short ribs as if the garnish were the most fascinating thing in the world, her silence serving as the final official signature on my eviction notice. The room remained silent, a heavy, awkward vacuum of sound where the only noise was the low hum of the projector fan and the distant clatter of silverware in the kitchen, as the most powerful people in Silverton watched my father systematically strip away my humanity. Silas continued his monologue, his tone shifting into a mock sorrowful cadence, telling the audience that he was sharing this because he believed in transparency and the hard lessons of personal responsibility, all while the slide on the wall showed a calculated total of $142,675.40. He was using the Founders Gala as a stage to publicly disown me, to ensure that if I ever tried to seek help or employment within this town, his narrative of my worthlessness would precede me like a toxic fog. I stood there, my hands clenched so tightly in my pockets that my fingernails were drawing blood from my palms. But I didn't look down, and I didn't let a single tear escape, because I knew something Silas didn't. I knew that the very projector he was using was purchased through a company account he had flagged as a charitable donation to the local school district, a small but significant piece of the 7-year audit I had finally completed. While he was busy mocking the $3.50 I spent on milk, I was thinking about the $400,000 in undocumented cash payments he had accepted for the Silverton Bypass project, money that was currently sitting in a Caribbean account he thought was invisible to the IRS. I looked at the mayor, who was now uncomfortably adjusting his tie, and the chief of police, who was staring at his boots, and I realized that they weren't just witnesses to my shame. They were witnesses to a man who had become so drunk on his own power that he was committing social and professional suicide in real time. My father thought he was the one holding the gavel, but as I stood in the shadows of the Silverton Country Club, smelling the rot beneath the expensive cigars and the bourbon, I realized that he had just handed me the final, undeniable proof of his own character that I needed to pull the trigger on his empire. The contrast between my $4 boots and Piper's ruined $1,200 dress was a perfect metaphor for the Thorne family. One was built for the dirt and the struggle, while the other was a fragile, expensive illusion that dissolved the moment things got messy. The gala continued after the presentation, the music starting back up with a jarring, upbeat jazz standard that felt like a slap in the face, but the damage was done, and the air in the room had permanently soured. I walked out of the ballroom, my footsteps silent on the thick Persian rugs, passing the bar where a bottle of the Macallan 25-year-old sat like a trophy of Silas's greed. And I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot where my rusted F-150 sat under a single flickering street lamp. The mountain air was sharp and clean, a welcome relief from the recycled breath of the 85 people who had just watched a man try to break his daughter for sport. I climbed into the cab of my truck, the engine turning over with a reluctant, grinding groan that felt like a battle cry, and I looked back at the glowing windows of the country club where my father was likely receiving pats on the back for his tough love. He had valued my life at a specific dollar amount, a number he thought would chain me to him forever in a cycle of debt and gratitude, but all he had actually done was give me the exact coordinates for his own destruction. Family is supposed to be the one place where you aren't measured by your cost, where you aren't a line item on a spreadsheet, but in the house of Silas Thorne, love was just another commodity to be leveraged, and I was finally, officially, out of stock. I sat there for a long time, the heater in the Ford barely kicking out enough warmth to keep the frost from forming on the inside of the windshield, watching the luxury SUVs and high-end sedans begin to trickle out of the club's driveway. I saw my father's midnight black Tahoe pull out, Piper in the passenger seat likely already looking at a replacement for her silk dress on her phone, and I felt a strange, cold sense of liberation wash over me. The invoice he had handed me earlier that night was now more than just a piece of paper. It was my liberation from the expectation of ever being loved by them, a final receipt that proved I owed them nothing, because the price they had extracted in blood and spirit far outweighed the $142,000 on the page. I put the truck into gear, the transmission clunking with a familiar, heavy sound, and began the drive back down the winding mountain road toward a home that no longer felt like mine, knowing that by this time tomorrow, the numbers Silas Thorne so dearly loved were going to turn against him in a way he could never have calculated. The audit was over, the books were closed, and the only thing left to do was wait for the morning sun to reveal the wreckage of the Thorne legacy. The digital clock on the dashboard of my 2005 Ford F-150 flickered with a dim, sickly green light, marking the time as exactly 2:44 a.m., while the silence of the Silverton Mountains pressed against the glass like a physical weight. The temperature outside had plummeted to a biting 28 degrees, and the truck's heater was losing its desperate battle against the high-altitude chill, emitting only a faint, lukewarm breath that barely kept the frost from creeping across the interior of the windshield. I sat there in the darkness, the smell of old upholstery and cold metal surrounding me, feeling the vibration of the world in a way I never had before as I reached beneath the salt-stained floor mat on the passenger side. My fingers brushed against the cold, industrial plastic of a hidden compartment I had carved out years ago. and I pulled out a black, ruggedized Western Digital My Passport encrypted hard drive, its 2 terabyte capacity holding the radioactive remains of my father's carefully constructed public persona. I had been preparing for this specific moment of reckoning since I was 14 years old, ever since the day Silas Thorne told me that my only value was the labor he could extract from me for free. And as I felt the weight of the drive in my palm, I realized with a terrifyingly calm clarity that I didn't want his love, his approval, or his recognition anymore. I had moved past the need for a father's affection and entered the cold, hard realm of a creditor seeking a long overdue settlement, because what I truly wanted now was my back pay, calculated down to the very last second of my stolen youth. I flipped open my aging laptop, the screen's harsh glare illuminating the exhaustion etched into my face, and connected the drive with a trembling hand that had nothing to do with the cold. After bypassing the triple-layer encryption and 2-factor authentication I had set up through a secure Swiss server, I navigated through a labyrinth of folders disguised as mundane school projects until I reached a single massive Excel file I had titled The Real Thorne Debt. When the spreadsheet finally populated the screen, it wasn't a list of grievances or emotional wounds, but a clinical, professional-grade audit of every hour of professional-level accounting, logistics management, and fleet coordination I had performed for Thorne Heavy Equipment since the age of 12. I stared at the primary data set, which documented exactly 6,840 hours of specialized labor that I had executed in the shadows of that basement office, often working until 3 a.m. before catching 4 hours of sleep and heading to high school. At the industry standard rate of $45 an hour for a junior logistics manager and forensic bookkeeper in the state of Colorado, the total was staggering. And as I watched the bottom-line formula calculate the interest and penalties, I felt the power dynamic of my entire life shift on its axis. Silas Thorne didn't own me, and he never had. In fact, according to the laws of commerce and the sheer volume of my documented contributions, I owned him, his fleet, his reputation, and the very ground he stood on. The granularity of my ledger was a testament to the hyper-vigilance I had developed as a survival mechanism, featuring line items that tracked every weekend I spent cross-referencing fuel injection manifests for the Caterpillar 320 excavators while Piper was at the mall with his credit card. I had recorded the specific dates in 2021 when I spent 48 consecutive hours rerouting the logistics for a multi-million-dollar highway project through the Red Mountain Pass because his actual project manager had quit in a drunken stupor, a task for which Silas had rewarded me with a lecture on the rising cost of residential electricity. There were entries for the 114 fuel tax credits I processed every single month, a task that required a level of concentration and legal knowledge that Silas himself didn't possess, and for which he had paid me in insults and second-hand work boots. As I scrolled through the years, the numbers began to tell a story of systemic exploitation disguised as family duty, revealing that the $142,000 he claimed I owed him was a pathetic, laughable pittance compared to the $307,800 in unpaid wages he owed me, not even including the statutory interest or the damages for the labor law violations I had meticulously logged. I leaned back in the driver's seat, my breath blooming in a thick white cloud in the freezing cab, and looked out at the dark silhouette of the Thorne Heavy Equipment yard, where 40 pieces of massive yellow iron sat like sleeping prehistoric beasts. I knew the maintenance history of every single one of those machines better than I knew the sound of my own mother's voice, and I knew that if I stopped managing the schedules tomorrow, the entire fleet would begin to grind itself into expensive, unfixable scrap within 90 days. Silas thought he was the master of his domain, but he was merely the loud, visible face of a machine that I had been oiling and repairing with my own life force for 7 years. The hyper-realistic detail of his financial crimes was also nestled within this hard drive, sitting in a folder right next to my wage calculations, containing the scanned copies of the double invoicing schemes he used for the Silverton County contracts and the secret offshore wire transfers to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. He had handed me a laminated folder of my debts at 11:14 p.m., thinking it was a leash, but he had failed to realize that he had given a professional auditor the motive to finally turn the spotlight on his own shadowy corners. Every time my father had called me a leech or a drain on his resources, I had simply gone back to this spreadsheet and added another 10 hours of labor, treating his cruelty as a billable event that increased his liability. I remembered the exact sound of his voice at the gala, the way the bourbon had made his words thick and sloppy as he projected my dental bills onto the wall for the amusement of the mayor and the chief of police, and I felt a surge of cold, calculating energy that pushed the fatigue from my bones. He had tried to use the Founders Gala to bankrupt my spirit, but he had only succeeded in validating my status as an independent contractor who was now ready to collect on a massive, delinquent account. I wasn't just a daughter looking for an apology anymore. I was a forensic accountant who had reached the end of the fiscal year and found that the CEO was insolvent in every way that mattered. The 2005 Ford F-150 creaked as the metal contracted in the sub-zero temperatures, a reminder of the junk he thought I was worth. But the data on the screen told a different story of a woman who had built a multi-million-dollar empire from the shadows while being denied the basic dignity of a living wage. The contrast between the reality of my work and the fiction of his narrative was so sharp, it felt like a razor blade against my skin. And as I watched the cursor blink on the final total, I knew that the next 48 hours would be the most expensive of Silas Thorne's life. I had documented the cost of the white Jeep Wrangler Rubicon he bought for Piper, noting that the $62,400 came directly from a tax refund I had generated for the company through a loophole he didn't even understand. Every luxury they enjoyed, every diamond on my mother's wrist, and every drop of scotch in my father's glass was a direct result of the hours I had spent hunched over that desk, and the time for a voluntary repayment plan had officially expired. I began the process of uploading the final mirrored copy of the drive to a secure cloud server that would trigger a simultaneous release to the Department of Labor, the IRS, and the local district attorney if I didn't enter a deactivation code within 72 hours. This wasn't a threat. It was a scheduled liquidation of a moral and financial debt that had been compounding since I was a child. As the progress bar on the upload slowly filled, I thought about the moral of the story Silas liked to tell about hard work and the value of $1, and I realized that he had never actually believed it. He only wanted me to believe it so I wouldn't notice he was stealing mine. He had taught me to be precise, to be tireless, and to value the truth found in a ledger above all else, and I was simply applying those lessons to the man who taught them to me. The silence of the 2:44 a.m. mountain air was broken only by the hum of my laptop fan and the occasional settling of the truck's suspension, a peaceful moment of transition before the storm I was about to unleash. I had spent 7 years as a ghost clerk, an invisible force holding up a crumbling dynasty, but as the clock ticked toward 3 a.m., the ghost was finally ready to manifest and present the final bill. My name is Riley Thorne, and I was about to prove to Silas Thorne that the most dangerous person in the world is the one who has been keeping your books while you weren't looking. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark, but the numbers burned into my retinas, and I felt a warmth that no truck heater could ever provide, the internal fire of a woman who had finally realized she was the one holding the invoice for the life of the man who tried to own her. Silas had valued my existence at a specific dollar amount, but he was about to learn that the real cost of his daughter's silence was a price he could never afford to pay, and the repayment terms were going to be absolute. The following Monday morning, the mountain air of Silverton was a memory as I stepped into the pressurized silence of the 42nd floor of the Wells Fargo Center in downtown Denver, a glass and steel monolith that seemed to look down on the rest of the world with the same cold detachment I had practiced for 7 years. The office of Marcus Sterling didn't just scream success, it whispered it in the form of original Rothko-style oil paintings and panoramic views of the Front Range that made the city below look like a child's play set. As I walked through the heavy, frosted glass doors, the atmosphere shifted from the gasoline-soaked grit of my father's equipment yard to a space that smelled predominantly of expensive old paper, high-end wood polish, and a sharp, clinical hint of peppermint that seemed to radiate from Sterling himself. Marcus Sterling was a high-stakes litigation attorney who specialized in dismantling corporate giants, a man who didn't take cases unless they had the potential to leave a crater in the legal landscape. And as he gestured for me to sit in a Herman Miller Eames chair that cost more than my entire truck, I felt the first real spark of a fire that had been smoldering since I was 12. He was a man of precise movements and calculated aesthetics, adjusting his $600 Cole Haan loafers as he leaned forward, his eyes scanning me not with the dismissal I was used to from Silas, but with the predatory curiosity of an expert hunter who had just been handed a map to a hidden kingdom. I didn't offer a handshake or a sob story. Instead, I reached into my messenger bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope that contained the physical manifestations of my father's arrogance, a 412-page dossier of evidence I had curated in the dead of night. I placed it on his polished mahogany desk with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. And for the next 40 minutes, the only sound was the crisp rustle of high-quality bond paper as Sterling began to flip through the systematic destruction of Silas Thorne's empire. The evidence was exhaustive and hyper-detailed, beginning with bank statements from Chase and Wells Fargo that clearly demonstrated how Silas had used my social security number without my consent to create a labyrinth of shell accounts meant to hide $340,000 in illegal equipment depreciation. I pointed out the specific entries where he had written off the 2021 Caterpillar 320GC hydraulic excavators as scrap metal, while simultaneously billing the state of Colorado for their full-time operation on the Silverton Bypass project, a double-dipping scheme that had funneled hundreds of thousands into his offshore accounts. The deeper Sterling dug into the envelope, the more the peppermint scent seemed to sharpen as he encountered my meticulously kept time logs, which were cross-referenced with GPS data from the company's fleet and internal server logs that proved I was the one performing executive-level logistics while officially being listed as a non-compensated dependent. I had documented every single one of the 6,840 hours of professional-grade accounting I had provided, including the serial numbers of the machines I managed and the specific invoice numbers of the fuel tax credits I had processed to keep Thorne heavy equipment afloat. I showed him the digital footprints of the software I had used to recover the company's data after a 2022 server crash, a task for which a third-party firm would have charged $50,000, but which Silas had seen as a standard chore for his ungrateful daughter. There were also copies of the internal emails where Silas had explicitly threatened to revoke my housing and car access if I didn't find a way to lower his quarterly tax liability by at least 15%. A clear case of workplace coercion and financial abuse that bridged the gap between family dysfunction and criminal racketeering. Sterling stopped at page 328, which featured a high-resolution scan of a handwritten note Silas had left on the kitchen counter 3 years ago, detailing exactly how I was to falsify the hours on a municipal contract to cover the cost of my sister Piper's private equestrian lessons. The attorney's eyes didn't widen. Instead, they narrowed into 2 sharp points of focus as he realized the sheer scale of the audit I had performed on my own father. He looked up from the documents, his expression transforming from professional interest into something much colder and more lethal, and he let out a slow, measured breath that smelled of the peppermint lozenge he was slowly dissolving. "Riley," he said, his voice dropping into a resonant, authoritative register that made the hair on my arms stand up. "This isn't a family dispute about an inheritance or a lack of affection, and it isn't something that can be settled at a Thanksgiving dinner table with an apology. This is a comprehensive federal labor and tax fraud case with significant implications for corporate racketeering and identity theft. And based on what you've handed me, your father hasn't just been a bad parent. He's been the architect of a criminal enterprise that has been using you as its primary unpaid engine." The weight of his words felt like a physical liberation, a final validation of the 7 years I had spent as a ghost clerk, and I watched as Sterling pulled a heavy Mont Blanc pen from his desk set to begin making notes on a fresh legal pad. He started sketching out the framework of a lawsuit that would seek not only the $307,000 in unpaid back wages and statutory interest, but also punitive damages for the unauthorized use of my identity and the systematic violation of federal labor laws. He explained that by using my Social Security number to hide his assets, Silas had committed a felony that would draw the immediate and aggressive attention of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, especially given the state contracts Thorn Heavy Equipment currently held. Every time my father had laughed at my $4 boots or projected my dental bills onto a wall in front of the town's elite, he had been adding another zero to the check he was eventually going to have to write to me. And as Sterling calculated the potential settlement, the total surpassed anything Silas had ever imagined I was worth. We spent the next 3 hours going through the technical specifications of the Thorn fleet, with me explaining the exact way Silas manipulated the maintenance logs to avoid EPA inspections on the older D8 bulldozers, a detail that Sterling noted would provide additional leverage during discovery. I told him about the white 2024 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon that Silas had bought for Piper with the money saved from a fraudulent tax credit I had been forced to file, and Sterling's smile grew thin and sharp, like a wolf catching the scent of a wounded deer. He assured me that by the time we were finished, every asset Silas Thorn thought he owned would be under a microscope, and the invoice for my life that he had tried to hand me would be seen by a judge as the desperate, incriminating act of a man who knew he was losing control. The contrast between the cold, calculated efficiency of this Denver office and the hot-tempered, diesel-fueled chaos of my father's life in Silverton was absolute. Here, the weapons were ink and data, and I was the one who had supplied the ammunition. As I left the office and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows waiting for the elevator, looking out over the sprawling urban landscape of Denver, I felt a sense of hyper-realistic clarity that made the world seem sharper and more vibrant. I thought about Silas sitting in his office back in Silverton, likely screaming at a mechanic or checking the balance of his offshore accounts, completely unaware that his ghost clerk had finally moved into the light. He had spent 19 years trying to convince me that I was a debt to be repaid, a burden that had to earn its right to exist. But in Marcus Sterling's office, I had realized that I was actually his greatest liability. The 11:14 p.m. deadline my father had set for me to sign the repayment plan was now irrelevant, because the clock I had started in this skyscraper was ticking toward a much more permanent conclusion for Thorn Heavy Equipment. Family isn't supposed to be a ledger, but if Silas Thorn wanted to play with numbers, I was going to make sure he learned exactly how much it cost to bankrupt the soul of the person who kept his world running. The drive back to Silverton took nearly 6 hours, winding through the tunnels and over the high mountain passes as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. I sat in the cab of my rusted F-150, the engine still groaning with every incline, but I no longer felt the shame of the vehicle or the weight of the $4 boots on my feet. I felt like a silent storm moving toward a town that had no idea it was about to be leveled by the truth. I remembered the way Piper had laughed at the gala and the way my mother had adjusted her $15,000 bracelet while I was being publicly humiliated, and I realized that their comfort was a house of cards built on the very documents currently sitting in Marcus Sterling's safe. Silas had valued my life at $142,675.40, but he had failed to account for the fact that a daughter who has been treated as a tool eventually learns how to take the whole machine apart. By the time I reached the outskirts of Silverton, the lights of the town flickering in the valley like dying embers, I knew that the fiscal year of the Thorn family was coming to a close, and for the first time in my life, I was the one who was going to decide who was in the red. I didn't need a birthday cake or a father's hug. I needed the satisfaction of a balanced ledger where the truth was the only currency that mattered. And as I parked the truck in the shadows of our driveway, I knew that the morning would bring a reality that no amount of heavy equipment could ever move. The trap I had spent 7 years meticulously building was finally set for the afternoon of the Thorn Summer BBQ, an annual exercise in grotesque excess that drew exactly 120 guests to our sprawling 5-acre estate in Silverton. The Colorado sun was a relentless, punishing force that day, beating down with a dry, white heat that registered exactly 91 degrees on the digital weather station mounted to the outdoor kitchen, making the air shimmer with the scent of searing Wagyu beef and expensive lighter fluid. Silas Thorne was in his absolute element, standing near the custom-built fieldstone fire pit with a bottle of imported Chimay Blue in one hand and a gold-plated spatula in the other, his voice booming over the sound of a classic rock playlist as he bragged to a circle of local investors about the new $2.1 million infrastructure contract he had just secured with the state. He looked like the picture of a self-made titan, wearing a crisp linen shirt that cost $400 and sporting a tan that suggested a man with no worries, while my sister Piper moved through the crowd in a new designer sundress, acting as the charming heiress to an empire that was secretly rotting from the inside out. I watched them from the shadow of the equipment garage for a long time, my heart a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of anticipation as the clock on my phone ticked toward 5 o'clock. The exact hour Marcus Sterling had filed the initial injunction in the Denver District Court. When the hour finally struck, I stepped out from the shadows and began the long walk across the perfectly manicured Kentucky bluegrass toward the center of the lawn. But I wasn't the invisible, grease-stained ghost clerk they were used to seeing in the background of their festivities. Instead of my $4 garage sale boots and oil-slicked denim, I was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal gray blazer over a crisp white silk blouse, my hair pulled back into a severe professional knot that signaled the end of my tenure as a child and the beginning of my role as a litigant. In my arms, I carried a heavy, formidable stack of legal notices, each one printed on high-grade ivory paper and sealed in a transparent sleeve that caught the late afternoon light like a series of warning flares. The conversation around the fire pit died down as I approached, the guests turning their heads in curiosity as the girl who usually spent these parties refilling the ice bins and clearing the trash transformed into a figure of quiet, terrifying authority. Silas saw me coming and a slow, mocking grin spread across his face, his eyes crinkling with the habitual cruelty that had defined our relationship for a decade as he gestured toward me with his beer bottle. "Come to finally pay your bill, Riley," he laughed, his voice carrying across the lawn so that every one of the 120 guests could hear the punchline to the joke he had been telling since the Founders Gala. "I noticed you didn't sign the repayment plan on Friday, so I assume you've brought me a certified check for the $142,000 you owe this family for your room and board." I didn't say a single word in response, and I didn't let the heat or the weight of his gaze flicker my resolve. Instead, I reached into my stack and pulled out the first document, which was a formal federal notice of intent to sue, including a comprehensive list of labor violations and tax fraud allegations. I didn't hand it to my father first. I walked directly past him to the man standing at his right hand, Mr. Henderson, the senior loan officer for the regional bank that held the multi-million-dollar lines of credit for Thorne Heavy Equipment's entire fleet. I placed the document in his hand with a steady grip, watching as his eyes scanned the bold-faced heading and the official seal of the law offices of Sterling & Associates, his face going pale as he realized he was holding a notification of a massive federal investigation into the very assets he had used as collateral. I continued through the crowd with the mechanical precision of the excavators I had managed for years, handing copies of the legal notice to the mayor, the city attorney, and every local business owner Silas had tried to impress with his fraudulent success. The silence that followed in my wake was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the San Juan pines and the frantic rustling of paper as the elite of Silverton began to read the line-item details of the Thorne debt. The documents didn't just outline my claim for $307,000 in unpaid wages. They provided a summary of the 7-year audit I had performed, including the specific account numbers of the offshore shell companies and the evidence of the identity theft Silas had committed using my social security number to launder $340,000 in equipment depreciation. I saw the chief of police take his copy and step away from the bar, his expression shifting from social congeniality to professional concern as he realized the woman he had watched be humiliated at the gala was now the primary witness in a federal racketeering case. Silas's laughter didn't just stop. It died a jagged, ugly death as he realized that the people he relied on for his social and financial standing were now looking at him not as a leader, but as a liability. He dropped the gold-plated spatula onto the stone hearth with a metallic clang that sounded like a prison door closing, his face turning a mottled, dangerous purple that stood out against the 91-degree heat. "What the hell is this, Riley?" he hissed, stepping toward me with his fists clenched, but I simply held out the final copy of the notice, which was addressed specifically to him and included a court-ordered freeze on all Thorn Heavy Equipment corporate accounts pending the outcome of the litigation. "You wanted a repayment plan, Dad?" I said, my voice cutting through the heavy mountain air with a crystalline sharpness that made several guests flinch. "I've decided to go with a different set of terms. I'm calling in the debt you've been accruing since I was 12 years old, and by the time the IRS and the Department of Labor finish with the logs I've provided, you're going to find that the cost of my life was the one thing you actually couldn't afford to buy." Piper stood frozen by the dessert table, her hand halfway to a plate of expensive catering, looking between our father and the guests who were already beginning to set down their drinks and whisper to one another in hushed, panicked tones. The white Jeep Wrangler Rubicon she loved so much was parked in the driveway, a $62,000 symbol of the money Silas had stolen from my future. And I could see the realization dawning on her that the luxury she took for granted was about to be repossessed by the truth. My mother, Evelyn, had vanished into the house the moment she saw the legal headers on the papers, her $15,000 diamond bracelet likely trembling as she realized the audit had finally reached the master suite. This wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a public exhumation of the Thorn family's morality, and as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn, I felt the weight of 19 years of silence finally lifting off my shoulders. I didn't wait for him to scream or for the guests to start their inevitable exit. I simply turned and walked back toward the garage where my rusted 2005 Ford F-150 was parked, the vehicle he had used as a tool of shame now serving as my chariot of liberation. I could hear Silas behind me, finally finding his voice and roaring about loyalty and ingratitude, but his words felt hollow and small against the massive, immovable reality of the 412 pages of evidence currently being processed in Denver. He had spent his entire life believing that everything had a price and that everyone could be bought or bullied. But he had failed to account for the fact that a daughter who has been forced to count every cent eventually learns how to make those cents count against you. The 91-degree heat was still oppressive, but as I climbed into the cab of my truck and turned the key, the air felt different, charged with the electric energy of a storm that was finally breaking after years of stagnant pressure. I looked in the rearview mirror as I backed down the long, paved driveway, seeing the 120 guests scattered across the lawn like debris after a landslide, their expensive clothes and polished smiles replaced by the grim expressions of people who knew they were standing on a sinking ship. Silas was standing in the middle of the grass, the charcoal gray of my blazer a sharp contrast to the vibrant, fake green of his lawn, and for the first time in my life, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had gone bankrupt in every way that mattered. The 5 p.m. deadline I had set wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was the moment the Ghost Clerk stopped working and the real owner of the Thorn legacy took her seat at the table. Family isn't supposed to be a battlefield, and it isn't supposed to be a ledger of pain and profit. But if Silas Thorn wanted to treat his eldest daughter like a line item, he shouldn't have been surprised when I finally decided to balance the books. I drove away from the Thorn Summer BBQ without looking back. the mountains of Silverton rising up around me like a fortress of stone and snow, knowing that the invoice for my life had finally been paid in full, and the change was all mine to keep. "Actually, Silas," I said, my voice cutting through the humid 91-degree air with the steady, unyielding resonance of a rock falling into a deep canyon, "I am not here to sign a single page of your fictional debt, because I am finally here to collect on the one you have been running from for 7 years." I stood my ground in the center of the manicured lawn, the sharp charcoal gray fabric of my blazer absorbing the heat, while my father stood paralyzed by the fire pit, his gold-plated spatula still lying in the dirt like a discarded scepter of a falling kingdom. I slowly lifted the primary legal brief from my stack, the heavy 24-pound bond paper feeling like a weapon in my hands, and I began to read the specific citations that Marcus Sterling had prepared in his 42nd floor sanctuary in Denver. "Per the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Colorado Wage Act," I continued, my eyes locked onto his as his face began to transform into the deep, sickening color of a bruised plum, "you currently owe exactly $307,800 in unpaid wages for specialized accounting and logistics management services rendered between 2017 and 2024. Furthermore, due to the intentional and willful nature of these violations, the law mandates an additional $307,800 in liquidated damages, bringing your immediate civil liability to over $600,000 before we even begin to discuss the interest or the legal fees." The silence that descended upon the 120 guests was a deafening, physical thing, a vacuum of sound so absolute that the only audible noise on the entire 5-acre estate was the rhythmic, crystalline tinkling of the ice cubes melting in Piper's condensation-covered glass as she stood frozen with a half-eaten slider in her hand. I didn't stop there, because the civil suit was only the beginning of the earthquake I was triggering under the Thorne family home, and I turned the page to the section titled Tax Compliance and Identity Theft. I think the Internal Revenue Service and the State Auditor's Office are going to be particularly interested in why Thorne Heavy Equipment listed your daughter as a contracted vendor for $80,000 a year on your corporate tax returns while actually paying her $0 and using those funds to cover your private country club dues and Piper's $62,000 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon, I added, my voice remaining calm and clinical as I watched the blood drain from my mother's face where she stood by the sliding glass doors. By using my Social Security number to hide $340,000 in illegal equipment depreciation and ghost payroll expenses, you haven't just been a difficult father, Silas. You have committed a series of federal felonies that carry mandatory prison time and the immediate forfeiture of your state infrastructure contracts. The atmosphere of the Thorne Summer BBQ, which had begun as a celebration of a $2.1 million contract, shifted in a heartbeat from a high society social event to the scene of a corporate execution as the guests began to realize they were witnessing the total collapse of a dynasty. Silas tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the arrogance that usually fueled his outbursts had been replaced by a raw, naked terror as he looked around and saw his influence evaporating in real time. His main investor, Arthur Sterling, no relation to my lawyer but a man whose family had controlled the regional banking sector for 3 generations and who possessed a legendary hatred for any hint of scandal or legal impropriety, was the first to react. He didn't scream, and he didn't ask questions. He simply stood up from the wrought iron patio chair, carefully placed his porcelain plate of untouched Wagyu beef onto the table, and adjusted his silk tie with a gesture of profound finality. Without uttering a single word to my father, or even acknowledging the excuses Silas tried to stammer out, Arthur turned and walked across the lawn toward his 2024 silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class, his departure serving as the official signal to everyone else that the Thorne name was now radioactive. As the heavy thud of Arthur's car door echoed through the valley, a domino effect began to ripple through the crowd, with mayors, council members, and contractors suddenly remembering urgent appointments and moving toward the driveway in a frantic, hushed exodus. I stood there as the tide of Silverton's elite flowed around me, feeling the 91-degree sun on my shoulders, but no longer feeling the burn of their judgment or the sting of my father's public humiliations. Silas was left standing by the fire pit, the smoke from the expensive grill curling around his head like a shroud, his empire dissolving into a pile of ivory legal notices and the terrifying reality of a federal audit. He looked at the paper I had handed him, the black and white ink detailing the exact cost of his cruelty, and for the first time in 19 years, he looked small, his 6'2" frame shrinking under the weight of the $307,000 he had stolen from his own flesh and blood. "You can't do this, Riley," he finally whispered, his voice cracking with a desperation that had replaced his usual roar. But the law said I could. And more importantly, the evidence I had collected since I was 14 said I already had. The contrast between the silence of the lawn and the internal noise I had lived with for 7 years was a revelation, a moment of hyper-realistic clarity where the value of a dollar and the value of a person finally aligned in the only way that mattered. Piper started to sob, the sound of her $1,200 dress rustling as she collapsed into a chair, realizing that the white Jeep and the Amalfi Coast trip were just line items on a ledger that was now being liquidated to pay the girl she had laughed at. My mother, Evelyn, didn't come out to help him. She stayed behind the glass, her $15,000 diamond bracelet catching a stray beam of light as she watched her comfortable, fraudulent life disappear into the shadows of the San Juan Mountains. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my car keys, the familiar weight of the 2005 Ford F-150 fob, a reminder of the grit and the labor that had brought me to this moment of absolute triumph. "You told me at 11:14 p.m. on my birthday that I had 48 hours to sign a repayment plan for a life I didn't choose. Silas," I said, looking him in the eye one last time before I turned to leave. "But you forgot that a bookkeeper always knows when the interest has exceeded the principal." I walked away from the fire pit, stepping over a discarded copy of the federal notice of intent to sue that someone had dropped in their haste to escape the fallout, and I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any apology could ever provide. The 91-degree heat was still heavy, but the air felt cleaner now that the smell of burning wagyu and expensive lies was being carried away by the mountain breeze. I knew that by tomorrow morning, the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country and the massive timber frame house would be under a legal lien, and the Thorn Heavy Equipment Yard would be crawling with investigators from the Department of Labor and the IRS. Silas Thorn had spent his life treating people like machines that could be run until they broke, but he had failed to realize that if you train someone to be a precision tool, they will eventually find the exact point where your own structure is the weakest. My name is Riley Thorn, and as I climbed into the cab of my truck, the engine turning over with a roar that felt like a victory, I realized that I had finally audited my way out of the shadows and into a life that was finally, legally, and morally my own. I drove down the long driveway, passing the line of luxury cars that were fleeing the scene of the Thorn Summer BBQ, and I didn't feel the need to look in the rearview mirror because I already knew what the wreckage looked like. I had seen the numbers, I had traced the fraud, and I had documented the hours of my own stolen youth until the total was undeniable and the judgment was absolute. The $62,400 for the Rubicon, the $14,000 for my braces, and the $8,000 for my truck were all just tiny drops in the ocean of the $307,000 that Silas Thorn now officially owed me. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where the math of the world doesn't apply, but in Silverton, Colorado, it had been a prison of spreadsheets and fuel tax credits that I had finally dismantled piece by piece. As I reached the main road and headed toward the high mountain pass, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a cool, dark silence that felt like the end of a very long fiscal year. I was no longer a ghost clerk or a financial drain. I was a woman with a balanced ledger and a future that no one else could invoice, and for the first time in my 19 years, the price of my life was exactly what I said it was. The moral of the Thorn legacy was written in the dirt of that yard. A story of a man who thought wealth was a shield and a daughter who knew that the truth was the only real currency in a world built on numbers. Silas had valued my presence at $142,675.40, but the final cost of his arrogance was going to be every single cent he had ever made and every single person he had ever tried to impress. I felt the vibration of the F-150's steering wheel, a machine that was honest in its wear and tear, and I realized that I didn't need the white Jeep or the designer leggings to know who I was. I was the person who stayed when the truth came out, and I was the person who made sure the truth came out in the first place, regardless of the cost. The audit was complete, the documents were served, and the repayment was just beginning. And as I looked out at the vast, open road ahead of me, I knew that I had finally, permanently, closed the books on the house of Silas Thorne. By the time the high-altitude winds of October began to whistle through the jagged peaks surrounding Silverton, Colorado, bringing the first dusting of snow to the mountain passes, the once impenetrable fortress of Thorne Heavy Equipment was under a full, systematic federal audit that left no stone unturned and no ledger unexamined. The transition from being a titan of local industry to a man under the microscope of the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Labor was a swift and brutal descent for Silas Thorne, who found himself stripped of the arrogance that had once allowed him to hand me a laminated invoice for my own existence. To settle the initial wave of staggering tax penalties, back interest, and the early legal fees associated with his identity theft and labor violations, my father was forced to hold a liquidation auction that gutted his pride, selling off 15 of his most prized machines, including the massive Caterpillar 320 GC hydraulic excavators that I had spent thousands of hours managing from the shadows. Watching those yellow iron beasts being hauled away on lowboy trailers was the physical manifestation of his empire crumbling, a slow-motion collapse that was necessary to fund my $450,000 final settlement, a figure that represented every stolen hour, every illegal tax credit, and every cent of the liquidated damages Marcus Sterling had demanded from his 42nd floor office in Denver. The collateral damage within the family was equally absolute and hyper-realistic, manifesting in the sudden, jarring disappearance of the luxuries that had been used as weapons against me for nearly a decade. My sister Piper, who had once laughed so hard at my humiliation that she spilled a Cosmopolitan on a $1,200 dress, was forced to confront the harsh reality of a world without Silas's fraudulent safety net when the 2024 bright white Jeep Wrangler Rubicon was repossessed to cover a portion of the corporate debt. I watched from my window as she traded the $62,000 SUV with its Sky One Touch power top and Extreme 35-inch tires for a dented silver 2014 Toyota Corolla with a high-mileage odometer and a faded interior that smelled of old upholstery and disappointment. The sight of her struggling to fit her designer luggage into the trunk of a used economy car was a silent, powerful testament to the fact that the golden child's shine was entirely dependent on the labor of the daughter they had tried to erase. My mother, Evelyn, was forced to list her $15,000 diamond tennis bracelet on a high-end resale site just to keep up with the property taxes on the timber frame house that was now under a massive federal lien. Her silence at the founder's gala finally being met with the cold, unyielding silence of a bank account that was rapidly approaching zero. As for me, I didn't stay in Silverton to watch the final embers of the Thorne legacy burn out. Instead, I packed my life into a few high-quality suitcases and left the rusted 2005 Ford F-150 at the edge of the equipment yard with the keys in the ignition and a copy of my wage claim taped to the steering wheel. I moved to Seattle, Washington, finding a 720-square-foot modern condo in a sleek glass building that overlooked the gray, churning waters of Elliott Bay, a space that was entirely my own and completely untainted by the scent of diesel or the weight of a father's expectations. The condo was a masterpiece of minimalist efficiency, filled with furniture I had chosen for comfort rather than optics, and every morning I would sit by the floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of coffee that I didn't have to account for, watching the ferries cut through the Puget Sound. The contrast between the thin, suffocating air of Silverton and the salt-heavy breeze of the Pacific Northwest was a physical relief, a reminder that the world is much larger than the small-minded cruelty of a man who thinks he can own another human being through a series of fraudulent spreadsheets. The final act of my liberation occurred on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, just as the rain began to patter against the glass of my new home with a rhythmic, soothing consistency. I sat at my desk, a beautiful piece of reclaimed walnut that held none of the ghosts of the Thorn basement, and logged into my secure banking portal to see the finalized transfer from the settlement escrow account. The numbers on the screen were crisp and undeniable: $450,000.00, a balance that represented the total reclamation of my identity and the professional validation of 7 years of invisible labor. I took a high-resolution screenshot of that balance, the white light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, and opened a new email addressed to Silas Thorne's private account, the one he used to monitor his offshore wire transfers before I had them frozen. I didn't write a long, emotional letter detailing my pain or seeking a reconciliation that was never going to happen. Instead, I simply attached the screenshot and typed a 3-word subject line that served as the final entry in the ledger: paid in full. Sending that email felt like the final click of a heavy vault door, a permanent sealing of a chapter that had defined 19 years of my life as a series of debts and credits. I realized then that the law was never just about the money. It was about the restoration of the respect that my family had systematically refused to give me, a professional acknowledgement that my time, my intellect, and my existence had a value that was independent of Silas Thorne's approval. By the time he read that email, his company would be a skeleton of its former self. His reputation in Silverton would be a cautionary tale discussed in hushed tones at the country club, and his golden daughter would be learning the value of $1 the hard way in a used Toyota. He had spent his life trying to prove that I was a liability, but in the end, I was the most expensive mistake he ever made, a forensic accountant who had successfully audited her way to freedom. The moral of my story is written in the silence of my new home and the stability of my bank balance, a reminder that family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't a business contract where one side holds all the power. Family is the people who show up without an invoice, the people who see your worth before you have to prove it in a court of law, and the people who would never think to charge you for the milk you drank or the air you breathed as a child. I spent 2:44 a.m.s in a freezing truck and 5 p.m.s in the middle of a hostile lawn to get to this 720-square-foot sanctuary, and every cent of that $450,000 was earned through the kind of resilience that Silas Thorne could never understand. I am Riley Thorne, and I am 32 years away from ever being a ghost clerk again, standing in a life that is finally balanced and a future that is entirely, legally, and gloriously mine to write. The mountains of Colorado are 1,000 miles behind me now, and the sound of the bulldozer engines has been replaced by the call of the gulls and the low hum of a city that doesn't know my father's name. I look at my hands, and for the first time in a decade, the grease is completely gone, replaced by the clean, sharp lines of a woman who knows exactly how to read a balance sheet and exactly when to walk away. Silas Thorne thought he was collecting a debt on my 19th birthday, but he didn't realize that the interest on a lifetime of mistreatment compounds faster than any bank loan, and when the bill finally comes due, there is no repayment plan in the world that can save you. The books are closed, the audit is finished, and for the first time in my life, I don't owe anyone a single second of my time. My name is Riley Thorne, and I am finally, truly paid in full.